I am quite happy to be called a TERF, but I will not... But don't call me middle class, because that offends me. The last Labour manifesto fell well short of pledging to develop an ambitious strategy to end men's violence against women and girls, sexual and domestic violence and abuse and prostitution. However, as Judith's already covered, it did say that a Labour government would ensure that the single sex-based exceptions contained in the Equality Act are understood and fully enforced in service provision. It also promised sustainable funding for refuges and rape crisis services. So in that respect, whilst it wasn't perfect, it wasn't that bad. It's such a shame that 2 years later, the new party Labour, the new party leader, couldn't even bring himself to say that only women had cervixes, which might suggest that he'd have a problem upholding a pledge to protect single-sex spaces. I'm not here tonight to tell you what I think a strategy to end men's violence against women and girls would look like. Suffice to say that's going to be my second book, and I haven't quite written that one yet. But tonight I'm here to talk to you about my first book, which is due out on the 25th of November in two months' time, called Defending Women's Spaces. Defending Women's Spaces reflects my 32 years' experience of working in specialist services for women who've been subjected to men's violence. NIA, where I currently work, runs refuges, focusing on women with problematic substance use. It runs East London Rape Crisis, and we specialise in services for women involved in prostitution. My experience, the research and campaigning that I've done alongside that, and many, many women that I've worked with over the years, and also independent research, tells me that female survivors' needs are best met in single-sex spaces. On the matter of males who transition, do they belong in our women-only services? Of course I say no. The minute you say that you provide access to services through gender identity and not sex, if your services become mixed-sex services. Men who've transitioned, and that's if you accept that transition can be meaningful, and not all of us do, are not a risk to women because they're trans, but because they're men. The most rigorous data that we have currently on trans males and their rates of committing violent crime tells us that at best their crime follows patterns of male offending, and that's only if they had psychological support as well as surgery and hormones. Without that psychological support, the study found that trans males' rates of violent offending were higher than those of other males. Defending Women's Spaces, my book, focuses on spaces for women survivors of men's violence. I look at sex differences in perpetration and victimisation of violence. I dismantle and disprove the myth that it's trans people who are at greatest risk of murder. I pull apart the lie that risk assessment can make it safe for males to be included in women's space. I look at how telling women victim survivors that somebody that we all know is a man is a woman is nothing more than a variation of the psychological abuse done to them by the man or men who've been abusing them. I look at trauma and explain why women-only space is necessary for recovery. I also explore why so many of the so-called specialist service providers seem to have abandoned their principles and stopped putting women first. Including males with trans identities in services for women can mean excluding some of the most vulnerable women who need support. We know this. We know that women will self-exclude because they tell us. Not all women will be subject to men's violence and abuse, though globally 1 in 3 of us will be during our lifetime. And not all the women who are subjected to men's abuse will develop a trauma response. We can recognise that some women need or benefit from women-only space more than others. And it is true that some women who have been abused by men don't want women-only spaces, but surely those women should not be able to deny the right to that space for those who do. Labour needs to show its commitment to ending the sex hierarchy. Labour needs to grow a backbone. The Labour Party needs to commit to ending men's violence against women. And unless or until we reach that utopia, we need single-sex spaces for women who've been subject to men's violence.